make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
So we have asked Americans really over the past decade whether they favor non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ Americans. And so what we have found, kind of that broad support for protections, right? So should gay, lesbian, transgender Americans, should they be discriminated against? Yes, or should we have laws that prevent that kind of discrimination? And we find, generally speaking, the vast majority of Americans support those protections.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, we're so glad to have you, and make sure you like and subscribe. Normally, my faithful co-host is the one to remind you of that, but he's not here today. He's off doing pastor things. So you got me, your political host, Will Wright, and today I am joined by Melissa Deckman. She is the CEO of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, where she leads one of the nation's most trusted teams studying the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. Political scientist by training, she's written extensively on gender, religion, and public opinion. And under her leadership, they have produced some pretty landmark studies like the American Values Atlas and the most recent report on exvangelicals, which we're going to get into all of that here in a little bit. But before we do, let me just welcome you to the show. Melissa, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. Well, I'm really glad to be joining you today.
Yeah, and we're glad to have you here with us. So before we kind of jump into some of the data and the numbers and stuff, can you give us just like an overview of PRRI's mission? And what is it that you all do, kind of like on your day-to-day basis?
Sure. So PRRI, also known as the Public Religion Research Institute, really is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that examines the intersection of religion, culture, and American public life. So our goal is really to better inform public conversations about politics and the role that religion plays in helping us understand current political trends, current public policies, current debates that we're having. And so in many ways, we often consider how religion both can foster and hinder democracy. I think we're talking a lot about the state of our democracy currently, but we also look at attitudes with respect to numerous public policies that might have a religious dimension. So, for example, today we're going to talk quite a bit about support for LGBTQ rights. As your listeners would kind of assume, there are definitely religious dimensions to understanding Americans' attitudes on those sorts of things. But we do the same thing with respect to abortion attitudes and immigration attitudes, and just more generally about kind of culture and politics. And so, in a nutshell, that's essentially what we do.
That's well. I'm really, really appreciative of the work your organization does. I was unaware it existed as of about 5 years ago, and now it's like whenever I want to know how people think about stuff, that you're normally the first place I go to. And
thank you.
Yeah, and I wrote a Substack recently, and so I have this kind of like, I don't know, you can call it sarcastic, like thread or series that I'm working on called "Wait, We're the Oppressed Ones," which talks about a little bit about the Christian persecution thing and the Kim Davis episode. So Kim Davis, for those that don't know, is a county clerk, didn't want to issue marriage license to same-sex couples. Anyways, we'll definitely talk a little bit more about that later. But I wrote a blog about it and found your 10-year study on like LGBTQ non-discrimination laws and this thing called like the American Values. I'm going to get that last out. Thank you. Values Atlas, and had no idea it existed. So like, can you just talk to us first about like, what is the American Values Atlas, and like how long has the study been going on for? Like what precipitated it? I'm just really fascinated by this study.
Yeah, so the American Values Atlas is really, I think, a treasure trove of really high quality data that's available to anyone. to use. Like part of our public mission is really to get data into the hands of not just reporters or podcasters, but also to scholars. So a lot of our constituents, I guess, would be academics who download our data sets on a regular basis. But what's really cool about the American Values Atlas is that anybody can go and kind of play around with the numbers and look at some kind of specific data over time. And so about a decade ago, we began asking questions about Americans more regularly. Not just religious demographic questions like how do you identify, how often do you go to church or religious services, et cetera, but asking them about a number of different public policies, including asking questions about LGBTQ rights, attitudes. And so what makes this such a powerful tool is that, we annually interview at least 20,000 Americans. And it's high quality gold standard probability-based sampling. And that gets a little bit wonky for some that might be listening, but really it's still the most reliable random-based sampling that we have. There's a proliferation of really, really bad polls out there in American politics. And so that's another podcast topic. But for today, just to kind of recognize this is a big commitment of ours in terms of producing very good, high-quality data. And the benefit of the American Values Atlas is that we have this trend data over time. And so you can actually track Americans' attitudes by the state level, by region, looking at different demographic groups, of course, religious groups as well. But you can go and play around with the data yourself. It's an interactive website that we have on our website, PRRI.org. You just go right to the top, you'll see the American Values Atlas. But if you want to know, for example, the percentage of women and men who support same-sex marriage, are they different? You can actually go through and kind of play around with our data set, and you have that really available to you. And my job, of course, too, is to walk with podcast hosts and reporters and others who might be interested to kind of give maybe the context for what we're finding in those really, I think, sets of data.
Yeah. So not to get too wonky, because I'm completely absent of any wonkiness on this. But when people look at poll data, survey data, you always get this, yeah, but that's not me. Like I'm in this demographic. Help us sort of work through sort of this. Because I'll be honest, I'm sort of in that category. If I see a poll that says something about me, and I'm just like, that doesn't really apply to me, help us work through sort of that cognitive dissonance or whatever we have.
Yeah. So I think when I tell people, and I was a political science professor for many years, and so I would always teach classes on survey research, and so what I would tell my students is you have to look at the methodology statements of organizations that put out polls, right? And so that's a really clear indication. If you see a poll from a website that has no methods statement, then I would say that that's probably a bunch of junk. So don't listen to that. But, we are part of PRRI is part of the American Association of Public Opinion Research. And so that is an organization that's committed to transparency when it comes to data collection. And so you'll go to our website, you'll go to other really high, research institutes and really a lot of academics have to be very transparent about how they collect the data. And so we talk about random-based probability sampling because that gives you the ability to sort of to have a good estimate of what Americans' opinions are. Now, you could take a random sample of Americans and you might end up with a sample that's just an outlier, and that happens from time to time. But generally speaking, when you have a large enough sample size, you have the ability to calculate what we call margins of errors. So we are essentially 95% confident that the true measure of American support for non-discrimination laws, we're going to talk about this in a minute, we find last year at 70%. We have such a large sample size that we're pretty confident that it's around 69 to 71%, right? So that gives us the ability to kind of project with some confidence where the American public opinion really lies, so to speak. But that's really kind of key here. There's been, again, this proliferation of more kind of convenient samples and polls where these large firms will kind of accumulate thousands and thousands of people and weight it after the fact, but there's always a higher risk of error in those samples. So that's why having the AVA we're so committed at PRI of doing those probability-based samples because they're the most accurate lens that we have. Now, of course, you can get into how we ask questions and do you lead the witness in terms of some questions and, but essentially we're professionals who try to have questions that are as neutral on their faces as possible. And you just have to kind of, I think, trust the process. Like, I think, I've been doing this so long as a survey researcher, you see really bad questions, like how often do you beat your dog or something? You realize like those kinds of questions are probably not going to elicit honest responses. But generally speaking, I think we're social scientists who are committed to having as neutral facing questions as possible. Again, finally, the other thing, again, I think I reiterated this just to reiterate from the beginning, the value of the American Values Atlas is we have that really great trend data. So we try to keep those questions the same over time to make sure that we're really deducing, like, is American public opinion stable on this? Has it increased in favor of this? Or are we seeing maybe some trends in the reverse direction? And what does that say about the state of American politics? So.
Yeah, so you set me up perfectly. So let's transition to the kind of like one small sliver on the AVA, and AVA, American Values Atlas, focusing on LGBTQ non-discrimination laws. So first, like what is that? And then we'll kind of get into some of the numbers.
Yes. Yeah. So we have asked Americans really over the past decade whether they favor non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ Americans. And so what we have found, kind of that broad support for protections, right? So should gay, lesbian, transgender Americans, should they be discriminated against? Yes, or in terms, should we have laws that prevent that kind of discrimination? And we find, generally speaking, the vast majority of Americans support those protections. Like 3 in 4 Americans, according to our last survey, say that they support those sorts of laws in place. And we've noticed since we started asking that question in 2021, a gradual increase in support over time. So 71% to now 75%. Now, I will say this. If you go to our website, you can look at every year we produce an annual report that looks at that trend data more specifically. In 2022, we did find that 80% of Americans supported non-discrimination laws in general. So there's been a little bit of a decrease that we've noticed. And I suspect that what's driving that decrease is really larger concerns in politics about transgender Americans, right? So what we asked, in fact, this April, we released a new report that was weighing in on the first 100 days of Trump's presidency. And one question we asked to kind of unpack larger non-discrimination protections from non-discrimination protections for transgender Americans. So in that survey, we asked Americans, do you support protection specifically, or do you agree that transgender people deserve the same rights and protections as other Americans? Now here, it's 71%. So still, most Americans say, yes, transgender Americans should be protected, but it's a slightly lower rate than we see for the broader protections of LGBTQ Americans. So I suspect what we're seeing is that a little bit of a fall off in support for non-discrimination because of the heightened nature of our debates on transgender Americans here. But the upshot, though, is the vast majority of Americans support these protections, essentially. And I think that's an important thing to consider. And maybe this is where you're going next. Most people of faith support those protections as well. And so we do see that, again, strong majorities of Americans based on religion are also supportive of such rights. Even some of the groups that you would suspect would be the least supportive, for example, white evangelical Protestants, Hispanic Protestants, maybe Muslims, but here it's close to 6 in 10 of those Americans as well. So I think that kind of complicates a lot of our understandings about how religion shapes people's attitudes about non-discrimination protections. One of my favorite figures, though, is that if you look at members of the LDS Church, Latter-day Saints, Mormons, formerly known as Mormons, strong support for protections. And I think part of that is rooted in their experiences as a religious minority. And I think that religious minorities in our data tend to be the most supportive, like Unitarians, Buddhists,
Muslim?
Muslims are 60%. So, but still high. But I do think that, the experience that religious minorities have in this country makes them very heightened, makes their concerns very heightened about discrimination protections more generally. And the thing about, members of the LDS, if you go to our website, you can look at the 50-state distribution of these attitudes, and Utahns, have among the highest level of support for these non-discrimination protections, which, and we know, of course, that the Mormon Church is not exactly progressive when it comes to rights for LGBTQ Americans, but on this issue, the legal protection, you do see higher levels of support.
That's really fascinating. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. So when you started the AVA 2014,
2014, 2015. Yeah, I think in 2015 is when we started questions on non-discrimination protections. Yes, it's about a decade. It's been around about a decade. Yeah.
Because and this may just show my ignorance, but like the term LGBTQ, like was that a term that was used as prominently in 2014, 2015 as it was or as it is today, and how does that kind of affect things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I earlier opined about the need to keep same question wording. Yeah, but this was one example. We first started using the terms gays and lesbians, and then we recognized that sort of the public discourse over the past couple of years have kind of grouped together rights for gays and lesbians to a broader subsection of queer Americans, transgender Americans, bisexual Americans. So we made the decision to kind of alter that little wording slightly. But really, I mean, I think if you look at it, there's still been this upward trajectory of support. So I think this is an example where that slight change in wording is more reflective of what is currently happening in American culture.
So you mentioned earlier LDS is sort of like a outlier, but how are some of the other religions differentiated on non-discrimination issues for LGBTQ?
Yeah, so essentially, I mean, we tend to find that very strong levels of support among Catholics, like 8 and 10 Catholics, are broadly supportive of LGBTQ discrimination protections. 86% of Unitarians, 84% of Buddhists. The religiously unaffiliated, again, high levels, more than 80%. And then again, sort of I would say the more conservative faith, with the exception of the LDS Church, which tends to be conservative theologically, you tend to have less support there.
And across the country, so looking at all 50 states, like how does Alaska compare to like Florida? They've got a big country in between the two.
Well, on the one hand, if you think about regions of America, the South versus the Northeast, we don't really find huge differences regionally. I think the highest level of support for non-discrimination protection is in the Northeast. It's about 79%. It drops to 71% in the South. But that's not a huge, I think, chasm. But individually, according to different states, you do see, I think, much bigger differences. And remember, we're a federal system of government, and for example, I was looking at the numbers this morning, and the lowest level of support are among Oklahomans. So 57% of Oklahomans support non-discrimination protection, still a majority. But, that pales in comparison to Vermontans. Is that the term for someone who lives in Vermont?
It'll work. It's
sure.
fine.
It's like 90. It's like 90%. So you're seeing really a range of more than 30% percentage points among the individual states. I would say Oklahoma is definitely more of the outlier, but we do see in very red states that have, I think, more Republican leadership, less support compared to very progressive states, and that's not probably that shocking. But I do think it's notable that you do have really big. A big range in support when it comes to non-discrimination protections across states.
I'm curious if, at least on the non-discrimination laws, are you seeing a reflection of that sentiment play out, in policy making or legislation, just to kind of like the political noise that surrounds sort of like that particular issue? And then kind of follow-up question. I didn't send this question to you, so if you don't know the answer to it, it's okay. But looking just at Oklahoma specifically, because you brought it up, like Oklahoma has a lot of different things that are being done to it right now. Bibles and 10 Commandments and all that other kind of stuff. Like, is there anything in your data that shows, that the things that the legislatures are doing is grounded on data that tells them that our people want this kind of stuff?
Yeah. Well, again, I would just say with Oklahoma in particular, which again, you rightly pointed out that in terms of trying to fuse more religion in their politics, and really religion from a conservative Christian bent, which means hanging the 10 Commandments in public school classrooms, or, denoting that they read Bibles in class, things of which currently, according to current constitutional law, are unconstitutional. I mean, obviously, they're egging for a challenge with probably a more sympathetic Supreme Court, which we can get to a little bit later. But there's really no data to suggest that most Oklahomans, for example, support those, well, at least support non-discrimination, overturning non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ Americans. That there's really nothing to kind of signify that. One data point I did find that I thought would be helpful for this conversation, in our last 50-state report, which was released in March, looking at these kind of broader issues of support for LGBTQ rights, we found that we broke states down into states that have non-discrimination protections currently and those that don't. So according to the Movement Advancement Project, which is a progressive advocacy group, but they track the state of such laws across the country. So according to MAP, 18 states still do not have explicit protections against discrimination for LGBTQ Americans. Now, currently, when it comes to, for example, job protections, the Supreme Court a couple years ago in a landmark case in 2020, the Bostock decision held that transgender Americans could not be, or gay Americans could not be fired because of their sex or gender identity. So a lot of people felt that at least gave some blanket protection. But again, 18 states currently don't have those protections. But from a public opinion standpoint, we found that in states that have those protections in place, 78% favor non-discrimination laws. So clearly those states are very closely aligned with strong public opinion. But in the states that don't, it drops to 71%. But only 25% of residents in those states that have no protections essentially would oppose those sorts of laws here. So it's, again, a situation where the public policy is very mujust different than what Americans in those state residents really are holding. So that's a real disconnect that we're seeing here.
Wow. So just switching gears a little bit, going to same-sex marriage. This is kind of like the part I'm really interested in, because you started this survey in like 2015, 2014, as we just mentioned. Something pretty significant happened in 2015, the Obergefell decision. So I'd love for you just to kind of talk to us about one. Like, talk to us if you conducted the survey after Obergefell, like after the hearing, and kind of like what was that like? And then like how was the data tracked over the past 10 years on that issue?
Yeah, so we first asked Americans about support for same-sex marriage in 2014. And at the time, we found that it was still a pretty divisive topic among Americans. So 54% of Americans supported same-sex marriage, so a slight majority. One of the things that's been really remarkable in terms of public opinion is that we have seen really a pretty strong growth in support. So back in 2014, it was 54%. Now we found our most recent survey is at 67%. So more than 2/3 of Americans now support same-sex marriage rights. And really, in terms of, it's really been sort of a gradual uptick. You mentioned Obergefell, which took place in 2015. We've just seen kind of a gradual uptick every year on that. So I don't think there was an immediate, like, the Supreme Court handed this down and suddenly everyone said, yes, we agree. But there has been a slow and steady progression when it comes to those rights. And I think it's a reflection of sort of lived reality, right? So most Americans, I think, know and love people who are gay or lesbian. And so I think that, that's where we're seeing, and really when this is an area where there's definitely age differences, right? Older Americans tend to be less supportive of same-sex marriage, although we have seen increases in support for same-sex marriage, even among older Americans here. So, but it's really been a gradual shift, even among Republicans, I would say, which might surprise people. They might not be surprised to learn that most Republicans are, back in 2014, only 35% of Republicans, supported same-sex marriage. And remember, when Obama first ran for president, he was only supportive of civil unions and not marriage, because marriage has such a connotation with religion, even though, of course, it's also a legal status. But even here, last year, we found that half of Republicans now support same-sex marriage rights. And so that's a big increase, 15% over time. And there's, again, more increase among Democrats as well. Like now 83% of Democrats support same-sex marriage.
Where in your data is the support for same-sex marriage the strongest, and where do you see it as the weakest, and you can kind of qualify that by region, by state, by you can split it up however you want. I'm just really kind of curious.
Yeah. So if you go to the report that I referenced before, we have these heat maps where we look at attitudes in all 50 states. And it's not going to be shocking to learn that support is lower in red states that have tended to support Trump in the last several election cycles. In blue states, it tends to be the most progressive in terms of support for same-sex. So we do definitely see that. Although last year, in no state, I think this is correct, we find it was less than 50%. I have to bring the map up here, but generally speaking, there are wide ranges of opinion based on the state in which people in which people live, I would say.
That's interesting. And I don't think that your report covered this, but I know that there was a study recently by some guy, I can't remember his name, but it was like an Oxford study that talked about SCOTUS and sort of their willingness to take up religiously affiliated cases. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not. And which got me thinking, like, if they overturned Obergefell, based on everything that you said, like, it wouldn't necessarily be consistent with what America is thinking on the topic. Like, is that kind of like an accurate assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good analogy, sort of an analogous case is the overturning of Roe versus Wade, right? So we track attitudes on abortion rights, and we find pretty consistently that most Americans, more than 60% say that abortion should be, actually 63 to 64% say it should be legal in all or most cases. And so that, again, is a decision. And I did a survey a couple years ago where we asked, should it be returned to the states? And most Americans didn't want that actually at all. Most say it should still be a national right. Of course, you have those who oppose abortion who say it should just be illegal in all cases, but there wasn't necessarily a desire to see it being returned to the states, although politically this is kind of where we are. I raised that mainly because, a lot of people who support same-sex marriage rights are worried because of the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe. And essentially that Dobbs decision, it shows that the Supreme Court is willing to reconsider rulings that are not necessarily what they believe rooted in the Constitution and our history. There's language in that kind of Dobbs decision that kind of speaks to that. And so even though I think the Dobbs decision, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I think there was something aligned about how it doesn't necessarily impact gay marriage, for example. Clearly, I think that conservative legal scholars took that as an opening to say, hey, let's revisit Obergefell because the same sort of judicial philosophy might apply in that case. And we have a Supreme Court that is more conservative and it's leaning and is more protective of and supportive, I think, of religious refusals and kind of a bigger role for religion to play in American politics and in policy. But clearly, if Obergefell were overturned, it would not have the support of most Americans. There is, of course, however, a federal law that was passed, the Marriage Equality Act was passed, I think, because after Dobbs, there was concern, in fact, that Obergefell was going to be next on the docket in terms of considering overturning that decision. And so this was kind of a rare case of bipartisanship where you had, in fact, most Republicans in the Senate, at least, banding about and having a bill that said if Obergefell is overturned, states would who had same-sex marriage rights would still be recognized in that capacity. So that was kind of an interesting case where public opinion perhaps did shape the decisions of members of the Senate and Congress. So I think that it's kind of a complicated scenario. But I will say this, it's telling to me that Kim Davis, who's that former Kentucky county clerk you referenced, who was jailed and arrested for refusing to issue a same-sex marriage license, she has filed a petition for writ of certiorari saying that her First Amendment protection for the free exercise, rights were violated. So all of this is to say, in motion, we see the mechanisms to try to overturn Obergefell. And I think the Supreme Court has indicated that they're going to be considering that case. They haven't decided whether they're taking it, but when you have that, when you have the Southern Baptist Convention, which is still the largest Protestant denomination in America, this year voting to say, look, the Supreme Court should overturn it. When you have some state legislatures saying, look, we're asking the Supreme Court to reconsider this issue, clearly, politically, I think we're moving toward a situation where the Supreme Court might be reopening and relitigating this. But again, it flies in the face of public opinion.
On the same-sex survey, like how do like the different religions kind of fare?
So majorities of Americans who are people of faith do support same-sex marriage rights. With a high of nearly all Unitarians, who tend to be the most progressive, I would say, in a lot of ways here, to 86% of Hindus, about 8 in 10 of Jewish Americans, Buddhist, and Catholics of color support same-sex marriage, but really 3/4 of white mainline Protestants and white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics. So really, we only have a situation where Latter-day Saints, and this is kind of a notable distinction, right? So Latter-day Saints supportive of non-discrimination, but only fewer than half support same-sex marriage. 35% of white evangelical Protestants and only 22% of Jehovah's Witnesses support it. So I think the upshot here is that most people of faith are supportive broadly of same-sex marriage rights. Even some of those faith groups are even at higher than support for same-sex marriage, which is about 2/3 of Americans. So I think the religious picture, again, is one that is very, it's more nuanced, and most people of faith tend to be broadly supportive of same-sex marriage rights, but not the more conservative, theologically based groups, especially white evangelicals, Protestants.
Yeah, is same-sex marriage kind of in the same category as like non-discrimination laws, or are they separate? Because it seems like that they're almost very similar.
Well, I think that you're seeing a little bit of a drop off in support. So remember earlier, I cited about, I think it was about 75% of Americans, 3 and 4, supported discrimination protections, but it drops to about 2/3 of Americans when it comes to marriage. So I think in some ways you're probably picking up that for many Americans, they still view marriage as a religious kind of institution. And so maybe there's a little bit less support. But again, my takeaway is that a strong majority of Americans, including most people of faith, support same-sex marriage rights. I think that's kind of an important thing to consider.
Got it. So another part of the AVA that you guys studied was religiously based refusals, which I thought was pretty interesting. So what is a religiously based refusal? It kind of gives a broad overview of what the data says.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a mouthful in terms of the survey question itself, but essentially we are trying to get at whether Americans think that businesses should be allowed not to serve LGBTQ Americans based on their own religious beliefs. So a really good example, the Supreme Court heard in 2018 a case involving a baker in Colorado, right? So this was a guy, Masterpiece Cake store.
Shop.
Cake shop. Yeah, that was it there. Actually, it was a 2018 case. And so essentially, he believed that same-sex marriage violated his religious beliefs. And so when a gay couple came to his shop to request a wedding cake, he refused to serve them. So that's an example of a religious-based service, refusal here. And I would say similar to the case with same-sex marriage as compared to the broader issue of non-discrimination protections. Here, Americans seem to be more willing to carve out those exceptions, right? They're more likely to say, well, if providing a service to a same-sex couple violates your sincere religious beliefs, there's going to be less support for forcing someone to do that necessarily. At the same time, again, we still find that most Americans oppose allowing those small business owners to refuse to provide products or services to gay or lesbian people if doing so violates their religious belief. That's kind of how we've asked that question in the past. And so we found in 2024, about 58% of Americans opposed allowing those. And again, the religious picture is very, very similar to the other two questions we've asked. Most people of faith tend to be broadly opposed to allowing those refusals because they believe there's a civil right when it comes to the rights of gay and lesbian Americans or LGBTQ Americans. But it's the groups that you might expect, like white evangelical Protestants, Latter-day Saints, who tend to be, I think, the least likely to oppose those laws, right? So they would basically be arguing that, people of faith who oppose same-sex marriage from a religious perspective or what have you, they should be allowed to have a carve out there. Although notably, we do see a little bit less support among white Catholics, white mainliners, Hispanic Protestants, but it's still a slight majority, at least with Catholics and mainline Protestants who would oppose allowing that sort of thing. But I think it's really germane in the sense that, when it comes to these sorts of exceptions, we now have a Supreme Court in 2024, or was it this year? I think it was. I'm sorry, it was 2023, the Creative versus Elenis, I had to look it up, decision, which basically the Supreme Court said that a web designer could refuse to create a wedding website for a same-sex couple. Notably, the reasoning was on the First Amendment right to free speech. Again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I want to go down that path. But I think the point here is that we have a Supreme Court. We see in just this past session in the Mahmoud versus Taylor decision, which allowed for essentially a religious refusal of parents to have their kids be in lessons that involved any sort of LGBT topic. There's a Supreme Court in place that is more sympathetic to that viewpoint, right? That people should, if they have sincerely held religious beliefs, be allowed potentially to refuse service to gay and lesbian people because of their differences there. So I think the political context is very different than it was maybe a decade ago with a different makeup of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and for the Mahmoud Taylor and some of the other cases, just for our audience, if we cover those with Rachel Lazar, so if you're curious and want to learn more, I'll put a link in the show description. I am curious about the age differences on, religiously based refusal or even like just views on non-discrimination laws, because it's like in my sort of like reasoning of the data, if the younger folks are, feeling this way, then, 20 years from now, when you do another study, like you would think there'd be a shift. But I don't look at the data as much as you do. So like, I'm curious, like, what can you tell us about the youth and sort of their views on religion?
Sure. So, I mean, generally speaking, on all three of the measures, when it comes to our attitudinal measures of LGBT rights, there's certainly, I think, the oldest Americans tend to be the most conservative, which is probably not surprising. Interestingly, from a generational perspective, I'm really interested in generation research. I just wrote a book about Gen Z. So on a lot of these measures, we didn't really necessarily see a lot of generational aspects. And so generation would be, Gen Zers. These are Americans born after 2006, roughly. Roughly. I'm sorry, those born after 1996. Sorry about that. Sorry, that was, I'm thinking more of the Generation Alpha. Coming, in the future. I think those are born after 2012. Millennials, who now, of course, are kind of broaching into middle age, Gen Xers like me, baby boomers, and the silent generation. And notably, like, for example, on non-discrimination, we didn't see any significant differences there on support for that. And I would say on same-sex marriage, this is kind of an interesting trend to kind of watch. In fact, we've seen a slight decrease in support for same-sex marriage among younger Americans, 18 to 29, over the past couple of years. They still strongly support same-sex marriage at rates that are higher than the oldest Americans. But I think that has more to do with Gen Z or younger Americans' mistrust of institutions more broadly, right? So there are historic levels of just not trusting in a variety of institutions, from government to the police to the media to lots of other things. And so I think I'm wondering, and that's something I want to be watching in the future, like where young people are on this kind of policy. But generally speaking, the oldest Americans are more conservative, but younger. And so I think younger Americans still broadly are supportive of a lot of those issues.
I want to switch gears here for a second, but just one more question about the AVA. How much longer are you all going to do this, or is this going to just be a project until we run out of money, kind of thing?
I think the latter, hopefully, the funding is there for this. I think it's a really important resource. This year we're in the field again. And so we'll definitely have more updated data for 2025 that will likely appear in the first quarter of 2026. But this is, I think, a really invaluable tool for public policy experts, for academics, for scholars, for the media. So our goal is to try to keep it active, as long as we can.
That's awesome. Well, recently you all did another survey that focused on exvangelicals. So I want to ask you some questions about that. But before we get into it, can you just define kind of like the working definition that you use for exvangelical, and then just kind of give us some of the high points of things, and then we'll drill down into some of the details.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that there's definitely been a moment for exvangelicals. Sarah McCammon had a well-received book that was just published last year. She's a reporter from PR. But I think there is, tendency for many Americans who were raised in an evangelical environment to be open about their experiences leaving the evangelical church. And so the term that's been coined are exvangelicals. And so these are Americans who identify themselves, in our survey at least, having been, their childhood affiliation is somehow related to being evangelical. And we asked the evangelical question in our survey has been pretty consistent with other scholars of religion. Essentially, would you identify yourself as a born-again Christian or an evangelical Christian? We ask specifically those two things. And then we ask, of course, in terms of childhood affiliation, were you raised in a childhood affiliation that was born again or evangelical? And so simply what we did this big study called Religious Change in America, and we compared Americans' upbringing with their current religious state. And it's not uncommon in American religion for a churning effect to happen, right? So Americans are, kind of comfortable with going in and out in some ways in terms of having a different faith tradition from what they were raised, right? People often will marry someone with a different faith tradition. So maybe you started out going to a Methodist church, you married a devout Catholic, and suddenly you identify now as Catholic. And so that's not an uncommon trend in American politics or American religion. And so really that kind of religious change survey allowed us to kind of look at where people started and where they ended up. And we identified in that survey that came out in last year, the data were collected in late 2023. We found that approximately 6% of Americans were raised evangelical and now are exvangelical, essentially. And we also found their pathways were really interesting. And this is looking at all exvangelicals of all kind of racial and ethnic categories, so kind of lumping them together. We essentially found that about half of those Americans just left religion altogether. So they became what we call a religious nun, not an NUN, but an NONE, right? So these are Americans who are unaffiliated. They've shed any sort of religious label. So half of Americans who are evangelicals just kind of left religion altogether. The other half sort of went into different faith traditions. Like about 18% became white mainline Protestants, another 12% Black Protestants who might have been sort of more evangelical leaning, but now are Black Protestants who don't self-identify as evangelical. 11% turned to a non-Christian faith. Others, like about 3% became white Catholics, another 1% became Latter-day Saints. So again, about half just left, and then half kind of found themselves into another faith tradition.
What's the number one reason, I guess, evangelicals are either leaving the church or becoming nuns?
Yes. So what we did was in our report, we drilled down a little bit more specifically into those that actually left. So we didn't have enough cases. So this was a survey of about 5,000 Americans, which is a pretty good sample size, but we didn't quite have enough cases to look at, like an exvangelical that became a Catholic. We just didn't have enough to kind of to really essentially estimate what the reasons were. So we really focused in on this smaller spotlight analysis that you referenced that people can certainly go read into those that left the church altogether. And we looked at it among white unaffiliated, white evangelicals, because they're the largest group here. And we had enough cases to look at those groups here. Again, a little bit of just kind of set the stage here. But generally speaking, among white unaffiliated evangelicals, the reason that they left, the vast majority said, 80% said they just stopped believing. Right. And that's pretty consistent with all Americans who leave religion. We find that they basically say, hey, I just don't believe anymore what I was raised to believe. We find, in fact, about 70% of Americans who are unaffiliated indicate that that's kind of why they left church, but it jumps to 80% among exvangelicals. But notably, we find much more support among those who left who are exvangelical, white exvangelicals, because of the treatment of gay and lesbian people. So specifically, we asked Americans, okay, would you say that this reason was important for you to kind of disaffiliate? And specifically, religion's negative religious teachings about or treatment of gay and lesbian people. And it was really close to 6 in 10 exvangelicals. And so that was a large driver for many exvangelicals to leave religion altogether. Other reasons they gave, I mean, this is kind of an interesting one that popped up. More than half said it was bad for their mental health. So that was a reason that they decided to leave. But if you think about it, if you're strongly committed to, say, supporting LGBT individuals, if you yourself identify as LGBTQ, I can imagine those things kind of go hand in hand, right? When you're learning and hearing messages that sort of say that behavior is sinful or not acceptable. So I think in some ways they're kind of going hand in hand. And another third said that they felt their church had become too focused on politics. And that's another reason that a lot of exvangelicals left the church.
Are there any, I guess, similarities or data points that overlap from the exvangelical study and like the AVA study on non-discrimination?
No, not specifically. I mean, we these surveys that we do, these very high quality data surveys, are very expensive. So we only have so much room to ask questions. And so specifically on this survey in particular, we did ask this question about whether negative teachings drove you from church or from your religious background. So we didn't really have, I think, the standalone questions on non-discrimination. I'm extrapolating. I would suspect there's probably a correlation there if I were to hazard a guess.
Yeah, and do exvangelicals' attitudes on, well, I guess I don't know if you would have that, like if their attitudes on LGBTQ type issues, seem to track with the broader public or tend to track more with like their former religion?
Actually, we do have a data point on that. And one of the most interesting figures, I think, in that smaller report we put out, we found, again, we're just looking at white exvangelicals here who've left church. 83% favor non-discrimination protections of Americans. And so, in fact, so maybe actually we do have the data that you were asking for before, but I was thinking about it differently. Anyway, nonetheless, so we found that white exvangelicals tend to be more supportive of non-discrimination protections. 83% support those. Same-sex marriage, 80%. And abortion legality as well. So they're definitely, they oppose religious refusals, right? Kind of similar, I think, with most Americans on that, but on the measures with respect to protections and same-sex marriage, much higher levels of support for those policies than Americans more broadly, but certainly more than current white evangelical Protestants. In fact, you see this huge split, right? So, for example, on favoring non-discrimination protections, 83% of white evangelicals say they support that, compared to only 54%. So that's like a 30% gap. But on same-sex marriage, it's even wider. It's like a 50% gap, roughly. 36% of white evangelical Protestants in the last year say they support same-sex marriage. That rises to 80% of white evangelicals. So clearly, I think that there's a big difference here when it comes to attitudes about LGBTQ Americans among evangelicals. And I think the data suggests that was a big reason that many of these former evangelicals have tuned out of religion altogether.
Well, what's the political makeup of most evangelicals?
Yeah. So most evangelicals, they tend to be, if you compare them to white evangelical Protestants, they look very, very different, right? So we know that white evangelical Protestants, about 2/3 identify as Republican. They're a core constituency of the GOP today. That drops to only about 1/3 of white evangelicals, right? And so, so essentially they're basically about half as likely to identify as Republican. It doesn't mean necessarily that they are, well, I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong thing. White evangelical Protestants, 59% are, I was conflating ideology and party affiliation.
Got it.
Sorry. Nonetheless, I think the general trend is that white evangelicals, about a third are Republican compared to 60% of white evangelicals. About 34% of white evangelicals consider themselves conservative compared to 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants. So essentially, they're a lot less conservative and a lot less Republican than current white evangelical Protestants. It's not to suggest that they're overwhelmingly Democratic, though. We find in our data that white evangelicals, about 23% identify as Democratic, which is less than Americans overall. But only 1 in 10 white evangelicals today describe themselves as a Democrat. So definitely there's partisan and ideological differences between evangelicals who've left church and current evangelicals today.
So I have 2 more questions for you. The first question is, kind of like looking back at all the, the conversation we just had. Like if you were to look at, all these non-discrimination laws and how people feel about it, religious refusal, same-sex marriage, so on and so forth. Like what picture in your mind do you think emerges about like how Americans feel about faith and like LGBTQ rights?
I think what strikes me about the data is a pretty consistent support for the rights of LGBTQ Americans, including among most people of faith, and certainly among people that have no faith tradition, right? And that's been a pretty consistent picture that we've seen over the last decade, growing support or steady support. And so I see a picture where legislatively and from the Supreme Court perspective, if you look at it from a judicial perspective, we have policies that are out of whack with what most Americans believe, including most people of faith. That's not to say that there aren't people who have sincere religious beliefs who strongly disagree with the rights of LGBT Americans. That is also showing up in our data. But I think, again, that's not where most people of faith are. And I think that's an important sort of corrective to make, because if you look at media coverage, for example, mainstream media coverage, if there is mainstream media anymore, I don't know, there's been such a, such a fracturing of the media landscape. But I think there's still this common misperception that religion equates with being very conservative on same-sex marriage or larger discrimination protection, right? So I think that is an important, thing to kind of consider. I always like when data kind of bring what I call truth to discourse, right? So I think sometimes it's important to kind of look at what public opinion is and kind of say, oh, okay, so there's a much more nuanced story when it comes to religion and these issues than you might think.
So as a person that looks at numbers and does these surveys all the time, I can only imagine that whenever a survey finally gets consolidated, that you get all giddy and excited because like
Christmas opening up.
I'm just guessing. If I mischaracterize like how you feel about numbers, please correct me. But what trends are you most closely watching, or I wouldn't say expecting, but like, what are the things that you've been looking at that you're hoping to have more clarity on in your next set of data?
Yeah, I think specifically when it comes to LGBTQ issues, I started off the beginning of the session or our talk here talking about transgender rights. And clearly, I think that Americans have more mixed attitudes when it comes to the rights of transgender Americans, particularly when it comes to healthcare for transgender Americans and minors. I'm interested to see to what extent those views are affecting broader protections when it comes to LGBTQ Americans, right? And so that's something that I'm going to have my eye on. I'm interested when it comes to Generation Z and younger Americans as part of my research. There is this growing gender divide among younger Americans. Like young women tend to be very progressive. We're seeing a conservatizing trend among younger men. Is that going to bleed over into sort of other areas of public policy? And that's something that I'm going to have my eye on. And not necessarily, we still find that young men tend to be broadly supportive of reproductive rights, for example, and support for LGBT Americans. But are we going to find that the conservative voting behavior we saw in the last election, is that a blip? Or is it going to spill over into Americans' attitudes about the rights of LGBTQ Americans or immigrants or other sorts of things? So those are things I'm interested in tracking. And of course, the religious dimensions of all that as well.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. This has been a very, very informative conversation, and hopefully our audience isn't their brains aren't hurting because all the numbers. If you love spreadsheets, you'll probably love this episode.
You will. And I would just encourage folks, please go to our website. I mean, this is all publicly available. That's part of our public mission. So if you really are a numbers junkie like me, there's lots of really cool things you can do with our data sets. You can look at them and kind of piece together some interesting analyses from the comfort of your home and your laptop. So
that's right. Or you can do it from your tablet like I normally do.
Exactly.
Well, thanks again, Melissa, for joining us. This has been Melissa Deckman from PRRI. We'll make sure we put all the links and stuff in the show notes. And to our audience, thanks again for joining us. And make sure you keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.